Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week, in our fifth and final session on V.E. Schwab's 2020 novel, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, we'll fast forward through a century of conflict and kissing between Addie and Luke. We'll get the true story about what happened with Henry on that dark and stormy night, and we'll end with a new beginning and a turn that will transform our understanding of what this book is. It's hard to believe that we're already at the end of this series. At the same time, this is a somewhat daunting episode because more so than most books, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue reveals itself only in the last movements of its story. I've been talking for weeks now about late reveals, and here they all are at last. And in that crescendo, the book challenges what we've considered important. It redefines its own shape. It also, we should note, picks up the pace. The scenes that we get in this part of the novel become more like vignettes, stripped of their soft interconnectivity to what comes before and after. They're more sharply delineated in time. And this is intentional, of course, because as we accelerate toward the end of Henry's story and the new beginning of Addie's, those sharp edges will cut deep. Let's get into the specifics, and then we'll zoom out a little at the end of the episode to consider the book as a whole. We begin then with Part 6, the ominously titled Do Not Pretend That This Is Love. And as we move forward, let's be mindful of which love or loves this title might relate to. We begin, as we've begun every part of the book thus far, with a curated art piece, and this one is special, because not only did we hear about its conception, not only were we basically present for its conception, but we saw it performed. This is the sheet music for the beginning of Dream Girl by Toby Marsh. And for me, this description is somewhat less evocative than the others, less effective than the others, not least of all because it's easier and more effective to hint at great art, to present a sketch that is more symbolic than representational and allow the reader to fill in the missing pieces, rather than actual transcribed, albeit partial, lyrics, which are intended to convey significance and artistic impact, but maybe fall just a little flat on the page. It's also oddly and inconsistently suffused with a modernity, including the knowing, wry, arched eyebrow of a postscript, quote, Marsh denies being under the influence of any drugs at the time, which maybe feels a little too self-aware for a series of exhibits which are supposedly all written by the same person, and which have been played up until this point very straight. What's perhaps most interesting about this, however, is the conscious repositioning of Addie's inspiration as a kind of dream for the artists that she influences. Per Marsh, quote, it was like sleepwalking, sleep-making. The whole thing was a dream, end quote. We've talked before about the connections between dreams and art, and even noted the significance of the fact that Addie can no longer dream, which mirrors her inability to make a direct mark on the world, which means, I guess, that we can take sleep-making, in the quote from Toby, to be interestingly ambiguous. It is sleep-making, right? It's mirroring the structure of sleepwalking because Toby feels as though he is literally making things in his sleep, but it could also be taken as something which makes itself sleep, a kind of artistic soporific, something to lull the conscious mind into a place that is more receptive to creativity. And if that's reminding you that we name-check A Midsummer Night's Dream in this novel, then perhaps it should. We begin Part 6 proper, though, with a return to Vion on the 200th anniversary of Addie's deal with Luke. And again, we're presented with storms. She finds in the graveyard that the tree she planted to shelter Estelle's grave is gone, split by lightning an unknown number of years ago. Immediately after her discovery of the tree, she rails for a moment against the grief. Quote, what is the point in planting seeds? Why tend them? Why help them grow? Everything crumbles in the end. Everything dies. End quote. And we can forgive Addie for this moment of grief, for this moment of frustration, for the thwarting of her act of kindness to Estelle's memory, but of course, the answer here is that we plant seeds not because we want the individual tree to endure forever. The individual tree was never going to endure forever, but because we want dozens or hundreds of trees to grow and change and die, for the world to be infinitely populated with an ever-changing variety. Addie herself has acknowledged this when she's talking about art. This, at least prior to the end of the book, is her reason for living. But in this moment of grief and loneliness and isolation, and we might speculate guilt, because we remember how Addie felt when Luke taunted her about how Estelle would view her deal with the darkness. In this moment, Addie is forgetting the metaphorical referent, or I guess to be more kind in our analysis here, not so much forgetting the metaphorical referent as just no longer engaging in the metaphor. That is, the planting of seeds of art and creativity in 100 receptive imaginations is very different from digging up a sapling and planting it over a grave. All at once, Luke is there, of course, offering consolation, but not, you'll note, denial. When she asks him if he did this, if he smote the tree, he replies, quote, "You cannot blame me for every loss," end quote. Which might be easier to accept if not for the connection we discussed last week between Luke and the storm. The scar of lightning left in the shattered stump of the tree might be the proof of further manipulation, further intervention, if you're inclined to read it that way. A recurring thought, in fact, for the rest of this week's reading, for the rest of this novel. To what degree is Luke telling the truth? And to what degree is he manipulating Addie? In Paris, on the eve of war, Addie immediately seizes the upper hand with a casual toast to "my Luke," which is apparently unexpected. He returns her ring, or what appears to be her ring, and makes the promise that he will show up if she ever puts it on. And she can feel the energy in the air of Paris, which Luke attributes to the coming war. And we get to circle back around to this idea that Luke is not a fan of conflict. This time, though, we get the explanation. There are no atheists in the foxhole. The coming of war makes people hold more firmly to their souls. It recontextualizes the frustrations and tribulations and the pain of everyday life as a part of something more significant, more grand, more fundamental. It is, it turns out, bad for business. Then, 100 years later, there's that accelerated pace that I warned you about. 100 years later, Addie and Henry are marking her 300th anniversary. They go to Rockaway Beach, but Addie is a world away, remembering the long years of her life and wondering about her relationship with Henry. And it's perhaps fitting that they spend the day at the beach, caught between the land and the sea, between the artifice of the concession stands and the bars and the seaside attractions and the cotton candy and neon lights, and the sea, right? The ancient untrammeled power and the dark beneath. And then we get this quote, "I love you," he says. And Addie wonders if this is love, this gentle thing, if it is meant to be this soft, this kind, the difference between heat and warmth, passion and contentment. "I love you too," she says. She wants it to be true. End quote. And it's easy if you're not a big fan of Henry Strauss, and don't worry because we're going to spend a lot of today's reading being big fans of Henry Strauss, but if you don't like him and Addie together, it's easy to read this as Addie pulling away from his gentle, sweet, soft boy kind of devotion. And of course, there is a part of her that is pulling away. We're conditioned by the book at this point to expect the word want to almost always be paired with the word but. This, though, is really a gesture toward who Addie really is. Why she ran away from her wedding. Why she made the deal that she made. She never wanted soft and kind and warm and content. And this is vital because often in the presentation of a love triangle, the character of the person caught between the two potential suitors, the two potential partners, kind of disappears beneath the conflict. The contrast, the relationship dynamic transforms into a clash between the two poles, between the two choices, between light and dark, benevolent and malevolent, safe and sexy. And it obliviates the character of the protagonist herself. Consistently, though, this book comes back to what really matters. Addie's character, her choices, what is fixed within her, and what has changed over 300 years. Even here, while she's obviously thinking about Luke because of the date, and we might speculate thinking about Luke in contrast to Henry's boyfriend energy, even here, Addie is still first and foremost Addie. She is never overwhelmed by the love triangle. And we might ask, too, how this moment relates to our reading from last week and Addie's realization outside of Toby's show that the candles that she is already sustaining are consuming all of the air she has to give to them. I also admit that I struggle a little bit with this scene, with this part of the book, just because of the timeline. Henry and Addie have, at this point, been together for 4.5 months. But I don't have a strong intuitive sense of that passage of time in a novel which is usually very good at delivering a sense of the passage of time. We cut back into the past, now in 1928, to a speakeasy in Chicago. Addie is considering putting on the ring and summoning Luke, but is stubborn in her desire to win this game, this particular clash of wills. And when he shows up, she assumes that this is exactly what has happened. But what's really important here, besides the speakeasy itself, this cocktail bar named 12, to which we will return later, is the idea of the game itself and what winning and losing might look like. Because Addie believes that Luke has given in, and he claims, at least, not to be there for her. Addie looks around and sees that this is his place, the angel that is not an angel, and the narrative voice gives us one of those gestures towards the future that we enjoy so much. Quote, "It will become a hobby of his, these kinds of clubs. He will plant them in a dozen cities, tend them like gardens, and grow them wild. As plentiful as churches, he will say, and twice as popular." End quote. Well now, planting ideas, tending them, letting them be what they will become. This old god, this being of wild nature, the gods that Estelle told Addie, quote, "swim in the river and grow in the field and sing in the woods. They are the sunlight on the wheat and under the saplings in spring and the vines that grow up the side of that stone church." This is something new. Even as Luke tells Addie through the end of the scene that she is no longer human, that she has not been human since she made her deal, even as he tells her that she has changed and has become more like him, he is demonstrating that he has learned from her, that he is imitating her sowing of inspiration. We even use the exact same language of seeds and wild growth. And if Addie is somewhat more like him than she was, he is also more like her. If Addie is less a part of the human world than she was, he is now more a part of it. And in this way, I think, we can begin to understand part of Addie's by now very obvious attraction to Luke. Yes, he looks like her stranger, and he's all dark and mysterious and dashing, but much more importantly, as we discussed last week, particularly in contrast with the superficially attentive but ultimately oblivious Henry, Luke pays attention. Luke watches her, he sees her, and is, perhaps most importantly, is changed by her. Changed by her in a way that all of her many artists have not been changed. Back home, Addie and Henry wake in the dark after falling asleep, and suddenly defiant, Addie decides not to leave Henry's side, so they go out to a bar and they dance together, and in the world's most predictable plot twist, Luke is suddenly there. The bar is frozen, except for Addie, and although I guess it's actually ambiguous whether or not Henry is included in the magic that stills time for everyone else in the bar, it's possibly an interesting point of speculation. We note his unsteady breath right at the beginning of this passage, and then he doesn't move or speak or take any action at all until Luke is gone. And we have to wonder if he is suspended like the others, as the narrator tells us, like puppets hovering on strings, or is he simply silent? Does he simply choose not to speak? Is he too afraid, too ashamed, too overwhelmed? Really, though, we should be looking at Luke's actions, because this is, so far at least, the most pure example of his performative theatricality. Sleeves rolled up, jacket on the shoulder. So fancy meeting you here, composed and comfortable. And what he says isn't prompted by the conversation by Addie. He seems to have prepared all of this in advance. She is defiant and he is unmoved. She tries to negotiate and he is unmoved. This is what he came here to say. This is all, as will become clear, a part of Luke's plan. And then we're into chapter 5, and what really happened the night that Henry made his deal. And as I've suggested in previous readings, this is the proof that the book has not been playing fair. It is one thing to be ambiguous. It is one thing to offer space for interpretation, and certainly it's okay to allow your characters to be wrong, including even the narrative voice from time to time, depending on how instantiated that narrative voice is. But the authorial voice, the author function, has a special authority. I mean, that's where the word comes from the Old French. First author and then authority, right? The whole magic of books depends on a trust between the reader and that voice of authority. And the truth is that the first version we get of Henry's story is not true, but it's presented in exactly the same way as all of Henry's other flashbacks, which is a structure imitative of and validated by Addie's flashbacks, which means that we have no reason to question it, no reason at all to assume that it isn't as accurate as any other account that we're given. And it's important, I think, that we distinguish between the experience of the characters and the reader here. It's okay that Henry lies to Addie. It's not okay that the book lies to us. This is, as I've said in previous readings, not playing fair. Even if Henry's account had simply been incomplete, it would have been defensible. It would have left space for the reader to speculate. And it's clear, I think, that the reason this subterfuge exists is that the book wants us to be as surprised and appalled as Addie is. The reveal needs to happen now, so instead of obscuring it, we lie about it. That's why the original version passes as a comprehensive explanation and is then overturned here in the most dramatic moment. And yes, books do worse things than this all the time, and if you're going to break trust with the reader, then at least this is a good narrative reason for doing so, but all the same, this is the major crack in the craft of this book, and a better way could have been found. Setting that aside, 2 revelations. The first, that Henry was about to jump from the rooftop of the building, and more importantly, that his deal was only ever intended to last a year. Back in the present, Addie finds Luke and negotiates an opportunity to bargain for Henry's release from his deal, then returns to Henry's apartment where he apologizes a lot and tells her that he has 35 days left. This locks our conflict for the rest of the book, and if the pace had already accelerated, buckle up, baby, because it's only going to get faster from here, too. We're going to slip more easily into montage, into sketch. The narrative perspective is going to remain a little more distant from the actual events, yet just as intimately tied to Addie's experience. First, though, we're going to cut out to a flashback that I know is a little controversial, and even if it's not controversial, perhaps it doesn't fit with the shape of the book as a whole, and particularly stands out here during the final act. I have read accounts of multiple readers being thrown out by the Henry reveal and this sequence back to back, because this is the scene where Addie has been captured during the Second World War while gathering information for the Allies, and there's a lot of smart commentary going on here about the ways in which people are dehumanized by war, and in that dehumanization, Addie becomes suddenly more like everyone else. That is to say that everyone is dehumanized in exactly the way that Addie has been dehumanized by her deal, but it's so brief, and the narrative purpose is so exclusively to reconnect Addie and Luke, and even to make her grateful, that we don't get to explore these bigger ideas. And again, we're just reminded that this isn't a book about history. So when Addie bumps up against headline events of the last 300 years, we can feel the friction in the storytelling, as when Addie taunts Luke about the success of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is, I think, rather naive for anyone, let alone someone who is currently residing in a Nazi prison in occupied France. These things are not the same. This, in any case, sets the stage for the anniversary date with Luke, and we'll notice the little flourish just as Addie is leaving on her date, just as the strange comfort of Henry's apartment is clashing with this otherworldly confidence of Luke. Quote, Addie should have stopped right there. She should have turned around, let Henry pull her back inside. They should have shut the door and bolted it against the dark. But they didn't. They don't. End quote. And we have seen the gesture to the future so many times, of course, but we rarely get the counterpoint, the forced return to the present. But they didn't, they don't. This return to the present tense, this shift back that prevents us from skipping over this moment, that forces us to be present in this moment for every move in this game of chess that Addie must, we're told in the last line of this chapter, win. It's beautifully done. We flash back from there to 1952 and Los Angeles and an interrupted date with a sculptor named Max, who doesn't seem to be an historical reference and doesn't appear in other parts of the book either. He's an effective distraction, giving Addie an excuse to ask for a date after Luke interrupts them. They go to the Cicada Club, which is real, and they dance to Sinatra, who actually did play the Cicada Club in 1952. This, then, is the next step in the long seduction of Addie LaRue. Ooh, good alternate title for this book, The Long Seduction of Addie LaRue. Luke confirms what we've inferred about his attraction, at least, their mutual attraction to some extent. Quote, even if everyone you met remembered, Luke says, I would still know you best. End quote. She asks if she knows him, and he says, quote, you're the only one who does, end quote, but we might wonder as to the accuracy of that statement, and also to Addie's underlying intent, because, we're a long way into the book to discuss this, but it's probably never been more relevant. For 300 years, Luke has worn the form of Addie's stranger. For a full decade before their meeting in the forest, Addie had been sketching that stranger, fantasizing about that stranger, but always, he remained the stranger. And we mustn't, I think, take this as a simple observation that he is the stranger because Addie hasn't met him yet. Rather, he is the stranger because that is a fundamental part of his character. That's a fundamental part of his appeal. He is always the stranger, always unknown, always something new to explore, always a novelty. And certainly, as we reach the very end of this book, we might wonder to what degree familiarity has, within Addie's heart, bred contempt for Luke. And it's possible that this is the moment when Luke becomes a little too human, a little too intimately well-known. tasting her mouth at first like it is poison, demonstrating uncertainty. Then, back in the hotel room, we're told, quote, that first time, it is a kind of fight, neither letting down their guard, each watching for the telltale glint of some hidden blade seeking flesh, end quote. Luke is as cautious as Addie, at least as out of his depth as she is, and probably, we can only speculate, much more so. But we're also seeing that she enjoys him. We see what she wants. Quote, she has kissed a lot of people, but none of them will ever kiss like him. The difference doesn't lie in the technicalities. His mouth is no better shaped to the task. It is just in the way he uses it. It is the difference between tasting a peach out of season and the first bite into sun-ripened fruit. The difference between seeing only in black and white and a life in full-color film. End quote. The difference between the bad peach and the good, that is, the right thing in the right moment, the best version of a thing that demands both patience and an awareness of its own temporality. The novelty of full-color film after seeing black and white film, but black and white film was, too, a miracle to Addie the first time that she saw it. The latter may be better than the former, but its main attraction is in that novelty. Luke is presented as being definitively the best kisser that Addie will ever know, but we have to wonder if some of that is, yes, the release of this long-held emotion, yes, the manifestation, the realization of this long-awaited seduction, but also the novelty of kissing someone who is very clearly and significantly unlike anyone you have ever kissed before. We also get the fleeting moment of Addie's agency after the first bout of sex is over, even to some extent Addie's exercise of a fleeting control over her environment. As Luke laments that he doesn't want to go and Addie closes the curtains, blocking out the light, preserving the darkness, creating the circumstances of his comfort and presence in a way that perhaps, we must only speculate, no one ever has. The relationship develops, but Addie realizes that there is something more between them than antagonistic desire, but reminds herself again that this is not love, that he is not human, that this is not real, even as she's feeling all of this happiness and contentment and comfort in their relationship. And again, we must wonder, we must speculate whether or not she is pulling away from Luke, pulling away from this darkness that has trapped her in her curse, or whether she is pulling away from this relatively stable domestic happiness, the comfort of being known. Back in the present, Luke takes Addie to Le Coucou in Soho, which is a real Michelin star restaurant, though in the real world it didn't open until June of 2016, almost 2 years after Addie's date. There's also a really subtle change here that may exceed my very modest grasp of French in terms of how we are supposed to interpret it, but way back in Paris in 1751, at Madame Geoffrin's salon, Luc is introduced as Monsieur Le Bois, the wood, in the sense of the woodland, right? Here, though, he introduces himself as Monsieur Dubois, which is more like of the woodland. It indicates a possessive relationship, which to my mind implies a strong change. Luc was the wood, was the darkness, was the night, and now he is Luc of the wood, and we might guess of the darkness, of the night. And I'm tempted to interpret this as a further step toward Luc's personification, a humanization, a separation of this version of Luc from his origin. And in this way, though not only in this way, we might suspect that Luc has been created by Addie, both in appearance, as is explicit, he looks like her stranger, but also in character. He's never had a companion, never had a recurring beat to which he can return. He's never had love. And though we can speculate that love is unknowable to Luc, as Addie certainly insists that it is, though the intensity of that insistence might suggest that Addie isn't actually as sure as she claims, we can speculate that Luc may not feel love, but we have to acknowledge that he clearly feels a kind of obsession. As he says later, Addie is not a want for him. She is a need. This is the scene where Luc tells Addie directly, quote, "I have no power over promised souls. Their will is their own." End quote. This is leveraged in a strong interpretive maneuver to explain why Henry can remember Addie and Addie isn't overwhelmed by Henry's, magical awesomeness. It's an interesting complication in the metaphysics of this world. It establishes a kind of level playing field for those who have made a deal with the devil, and that speaks to stories like Death playing chess in Akira Kurosawa's The Seventh Seal, or Death playing other games in Peter Hewitt's 1991 classic Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, a movie just as important, I'm sure, as The Seventh Seal, or the devil competing in a fiddle contest at the hypothetical crossroads. Once you enter into a deal, there's a compact. There is a kind of transparency there. This, by the way, goes some way toward making explicit that distinction that I was discussing last week between real characters, quote-unquote real characters, and the supporting cast in fairy tales. This maneuver literally makes everyone who isn't involved directly with Luke, everyone who has not yet made a deal, into a kind of pawn. I don't know, however, if this is true. I don't know if we can trust what Luke says here. And though we might be scandalized at the possibility that the devil would lie to someone he's trying to date, we have to admit the possibility, because we've spent a lot of time in this part of the book gesturing toward how many souls are waiting for Luke in the speakeasy in Chicago, in the opera house in Munich during the production of Tristan and Isolde, which is mentioned again at the very beginning of this scene so that we are already thinking about it. It is present in our memory right at the point when Luke is challenging our understanding of what is happening, because if that theater was, as Luke implies, full of people who have made deals, well, would Addie be remembered by all of them? Could Addie just troll the theaters and the movie backlots and the recording studios of the world, ducking into every room twice to see who remembers her? It is possible, we have to admit, and the book studiously avoids giving us any kind of direct evidence on this score, but minor spoilers for the end of the book, the narrative maneuver here at the end is absolutely to isolate Addie and Luke, entangling them only and specifically with each other, and that forces us very powerfully to question whether this is a true statement, whether it is true that anyone who has made a deal would be immune, therefore, from Addie's deal. So my read of all of this is that Luke is lying here, and all of this theatricality, and wow, but we maybe don't get a more theatrical moment in the entire book than Luke turning the dessert into literal ashes because Addie brings up Henry at the end of the scene. All of this theatricality is a part of the plan. More on that as we move forward. In New Orleans in 1970, Luke offers Addie a home that will endure as they talk of love. Addie, afraid that he is right, that they really do have feelings for each other, this introduces the Yellow House on Bourbon Street, foreshadowed literally in the second chapter of the book. That's what I mean by a late reveal. This is the scene in which Luke first says, "I love you," and it's interesting to contrast that with Henry saying the same thing on the train. Addie immediately wondering if this gentle, comfortable, harmless thing is love, but absolutely believing that Henry means it, while in New Orleans, she rejects the words immediately, only to fear that they are true. And here, we might feel that the book is being a little undone, I think, by its own pace, because we really are racing ahead. In this very brief chapter, we get the house in New Orleans, we get the leather jacket, we get Luke's taking of the soul of the old woman, which is witnessed by Addie, the woman consumed by the darkness. Two things which have been present in the background of the narrative from the very beginning of the book, and another that feels as though it should be an incredibly significant turning point, all compressed into, 3 pages? Gone in a moment. Back in the present, Luke takes Addie to the Low Road, the club where he is welcomed as Mr. Green, which, given our talk about names earlier, I'm tempted to read as a continuation of the Monsieur Dubois phenomenon, right? A connection with the old world, with the deepest parts of nature, even perhaps with the Green Man, a figure in folklore representing pre-Christian ecological harmony, as well, of course, as the color of Luke's ever-changing eyes. Luke takes Addie to the railing overlooking the city. Oh, and weeks ago, we discussed Addie climbing the stairs at Sacré-Cœur in Paris to look at the stars on her birthday. This is the sequence where she meets Remy for the first time. And I mentioned that this particular image would be inverted at the end of the book. And here it is, the inversion. A starless night, a pale glow above, but constellations of lights in the city below. And it's no coincidence that Addie's perspective on stars has now been completely turned upside down. There, back in Paris, she is innocent. She's about to have her first love affair. She's about to have her first positive sexual experience. Here, she's with Luke, no longer innocent, no longer finding her way, but instead trying to make her way. Here, as they discuss Henry, Addie accidentally, as is her way, tells the truth. Quote, "You see only flaws and faults, weaknesses to be exploited, but humans are messy, Luke. That's the wonder of them. They live and love and make mistakes. They feel so much. And maybe I am no longer one of them. The words tear through her as she says them because she knows this much is true, for better or worse. But I remember, she presses on, I remember what it's like, and Henry is lost. Maybe I am no longer one of them, she says. Here atop the skyscraper, the night sky inverted, brokering for mercy with the devil, and as we see in the following moments, now willing to trade souls like currency. Again, Luke lies. He offers her the trade, Henry's soul for one in the crowd in the low road, and Addie actually chooses. But Luke instead uses this as a demonstration of her inhumanity, as perhaps he should. We flash back to New Orleans now in 1984 with Addie in bed with Luke and feeling increasingly desperate because he is expressing ownership over her. My Adeline, we belong together. You belong to me. Addie may be almost 300 years old, but some things have not changed, as is demonstrated when Luke makes a mistake when he says the word surrender, and Addie responds, as she always has. And if we're going to put any trust in what Luke is saying at all, and we shouldn't, I understand we shouldn't, then it seems as though this is a genuine mistake. It seems as though he does not mean to use the word surrender in this moment. It does seem to be a consequence of the fact that even after all this time, he doesn't understand who Addie most fundamentally is, or what matters to her, or how fierce she can be. Because he's talking about altering the deal. He's talking about bending it. This is a negotiation, a soft negotiation, but a negotiation nonetheless, that is absolutely happening on her turf. This is for her benefit. But her surrender, at least as she interprets that word, wouldn't be an alteration of the deal. It would be the fulfillment of it. They fight, the house burns, and Addie won't see Luke again for 30 years. And this, by the way, this is an outright contradiction in the text. This is a mistake of some sort, because when Addie wakes in the dark earlier in this part of the book, after the day trip to Rockaway, she thinks that it's been almost 40 years since she saw Luke. All through this chapter, in fact, she insists it's been 40 years. But it's been from May the 1st, 1984 to July the 29th, 2014, 30 years and 3 months. And as a footnote, back in chapter 14 of part 5, right after the 4th of July party, Henry asks how long it's been since Addie saw Luke, and she says almost 30 years ago. At that point, it was 30 years and 2 months. And I say this not to nitpick the text, but for two reasons. One, the timeline is going to be super important in my interpretation of certain events which are coming up, which we will get to in a little while, and I think it's really important that it's 30 years. Two, all of this rests simply on the date of May 1st, 1984, given at the beginning of chapter 14 of part 6. The previous chapter set in New Orleans in this part of the timeline was chapter 12, set on July 29th, 1970. So this means that Addie and Luke were shacked up in that house on Bourbon Street for 14 years, and it's possible that they were together for 14 years, and Addie keeps saying 40 when she means 30, or that the date at the beginning of chapter 14 is wrong and should read May 1st, 1974, meaning that they were together for 4 years, that it's really been 40 years since then, and Addie misspoke back in part 5 when she said 30. Any explanation for this is honestly as good as any other, because I genuinely consider it a mistake, an editorial oversight. If you are friends with Victoria Schwab, then by all means feel free to ask her for clarification. But I don't think that there's anything here to be interpreted. I think it is just a mistake. As I said, though, I'm taking 30 years to be true because I think it's important. More on that in a moment. Luke transports Addie into Central Park, and this is the climactic scene in our understanding of their romance. He says that he will do what she wants if she dances with him. They dance, but he still refuses. This is the second moment in quick succession where he has offered her something, made a deal with her, and then immediately broken it, not followed through with his implicit promise. But that doesn't matter, because really, they're remembering their relationship. The real revelation is one that we might have been anticipating, that Luke orchestrated the whole thing. Quote, "You must have thought yourself so clever," he is saying now. "Star-crossed lovers brought together by chance. What are the odds that you would meet, that you would both be bound to me, both have sold your souls for something only the other could provide? When the truth is so much easier than that. I put Henry in your path. I gave him to you, wrapped and ribboned like a gift." End quote. And this is the heart of it all. It's tempting to spend the next half hour talking about just this, but I will try and limit myself to no more than a few minutes because we've still got a lot of book to get to. It is tempting to interpret this moment from Luke as a rebuke to Addie and Henry. They did, in fact, think that they were so clever or lucky that they had escaped his notice, and Addie, by now, should have known better. The careful reader may even have been anticipating this move, and Luke's explanation slots into place in exactly the way that we would expect. Luke finds Henry on the rooftop, makes the deal, and sits back to watch the fireworks. But I think it goes much further than that. All of this is going to be speculative, but not only do I think that this interpretation fits all the information we're given, I think that it gives a perspective from which we can enjoy the book even more. Addie burns down the Yellow House in New Orleans on May the 1st, 1984. Henry is born June 13th, 1985. Born with the broken heart which the doctors repair, but which is never really mended, which leaves him exposed to the ache and the urgency of the world. Born with storms in his head, storms like those so often associated with Luke, storms like the one in Addie's head that drove her back to Vion on the 50th anniversary of her deal. Luke doesn't just find Henry on the brink, on the edge of the roof, marveling in a coincidence that they should look so alike. I think Luke drives Henry to the rooftop in the first place through a lifetime of what would look to the outside world like a depressive disorder, but which would conveniently resist clinical care or diagnosis. We might even wonder if what Henry feels, that exposure, those vivid and passionate relationships which end in heartbreak, we might wonder if those are recreations of what Luke is feeling in the aftermath of his relationship with Addie, the ache, the urgency, even the swings to anger. Quote from Henry, "He'd fallen before. Sophia in high school, Robbie in college, Sarah, Ethan, Jana, but it was always hard, messy, full of starts and stops, wrong turns and dead ends." End quote. It's interesting, too, to think about his theological studies through the lens of Luke's influence. Quote, "You see the holy texts as stories, sweeping epics, but the more you study, the less you believe in any of it." End quote. And of course, under all of that, well, there's the resemblance, there's the similarity we noted between Luke and Henry's brother David during what we took to be their first meeting. Luke asks Addie what are the odds that they should meet, Addie and Henry, when they are both already bound to him, but really, what are the odds that Luke should just happen to meet a desperate young man who looks enough like Addie's fictional stranger, who just so happens to be looking for a deal on a rooftop mere blocks away from where Addie is, presumably spending the night with Sam or Toby or some other New York artist? Well, here's the thing. I guess it is possible. It is possible that Henry's life is just a mundane and awful kind of tragedy, just a world that is too often violent, bruising a boy insufficiently protected, and that Luke just happens to find him at the right time. But this is a fairy tale. And when we were talking about Henry as a Tim Burton character, a constructed boy, this is exactly what I was thinking of. Someone who is twisted by Luke from birth into a weapon to be deployed against Addie, a way of breaking her heart, a means of extracting from her, well, we'll see what Luke ultimately wants from her and how well that works out for him as we approach the end of the book. This interpretation, I think, understanding that Luke has been present in Henry's life since birth, that he is, to paraphrase Blofeld, the author of all Henry's pain, this has two great benefits, two powerful advantages, as well as being narratively compelling. The first big advantage is that it absolutely confirms Luke's malevolence, if such a confirmation were needed. The other is that it excuses the imperfect fairy taleized depiction of Henry's mental health issues, because they're not real. It's not really depression, so it doesn't need to be depicted like depression. It is more like a curse. And you know, you can even take this one step further if you're inclined to lean into the fairy tale magic of the whole thing, if you maybe have a little extra red thread laying around for your corkboard, because we've hit a couple of times in this part of the book the names that Luke gives his businesses, his honey traps for the desperate. We get 12, the speakeasy named for midday and midnight. We get the Low Road, the bar atop the skyscraper, and Perdition, which is at least implied to be a sex club of some kind. These are the places seeded by Luke to ensnare those with souls for sale, and their names are certainly of a sort. There is, let's say, a creative consistency between those three names. And with all of that in mind, let's consider this from chapter 17 of part 1. Quote, "Set off from the curb and down a short flight of steps, there was a shop half hidden by the line of the street. The awning was clearly once purple, but has long faded toward grey, though the shop's name is still legible, picked out in white lettering. The Last Word. A used bookstore, judging by the name, and the windows brimming with stacked spines. Addie's pulse thrills a little. She was certain she'd found them all. But that is the brilliant thing about New York. Addie has wandered a fair portion of the 5 boroughs, and still the city has its secrets, some tucked in corners, basement bars, speakeasies, members-only clubs, and others sitting in plain sight. Like Easter eggs in a movie, the ones you don't notice until the second or third viewing, and not like Easter eggs at all. Because no matter how many times she walks these blocks, no matter how many hours or days or years she spends learning the contours of New York, as soon as she turns her back, it seems to shift again, reassemble. Buildings go up and come down, businesses open and close, people arrive and depart, and the deck shuffles itself again and again and again. Of course, she goes in. End quote. 12. The Low Road. Perdition. The Last Word, a mysterious little used bookstore in Manhattan which belongs to someone we've never met, which provides a modest income to a young man very much in need of a modest income, but also in need of lots of free time to pursue a romantic relationship. And of course, Addie goes in because we know she can't resist bookstores, so anyone who pays attention to her habits over the long years will also know that. Did Luke create The Last Word? Did Meredith, the unseen owner, make a deal for enough money to spend the rest of her life traveling? Is it a coincidence that B is researching Addie in this same small bookstore? It's possible. It's tantalizing. The point is this. We'll never be certain of how much of the story has been orchestrated by Luke, but given where we end up, I favor the most inclusive interpretation. I want to credit our fairy tale villain with the best possible plan, because that makes our heroine's final move all the more impressive. Again, more on that in just a little while. Back in the present, Luke vanishes, telling Addie to spend what time she has left with her human love. She returns to Henry, only to discover that a week has already passed, and he asks her not to fight anymore, to simply accept this fate. I think the next chapters, in which we fast forward through Henry's remaining days in an impressionistic blur that keeps painfully resolving into crystal clear, crystal sharp moments of hope and hurt, I genuinely think that this is a masterpiece, a perfect example of what we were talking about previously, about how well Henry works when he's not taking control of the narrative, but is simply present in it. We're too distant to get more than fragments from him now, but those fragments build to something beautiful and romantic and tragic, particularly the farewells to Bea and Robbie, which are so simple and sincere, elevating the good from the bad, because in the end, that is what is worth remembering. We keep resolving down to simple statements. He is, he does, he is. This is the payoff of the present tense strategy of the book, which, as I've said, I think is pretty consistently strong throughout the entire novel, but never as effective as it is here on the bleeding edge of the moment, with the number of pages diminishing too fast, just as Henry's moments are. We get the brief reference to Addie slipping out of bed in the middle of the night and then returning, and Henry thinks nothing of it, because unlike us, he hasn't spent the last month reading this book and learning its narrative maneuvers. But here's another. As the panic fights its way back to the surface on Henry's last day, we're told, quote, "And Addie looks at him as if she can read his mind, see the storm building in his head. But she is sunshine. She is clear skies." End quote. And Addie isn't exactly that, of course, and it's perhaps no surprise to us that Henry can't quite see her clearly, but she is finally being depicted as something that is a very important part of her characterization. She is the opposite of Luke. And then, the reveal. And honestly, the end of Henry's life is articulated with such care and warmth and kindness and commitment that, though we're obviously expecting by this point some kind of pivot, though we noted Addie slipping out of bed and are waiting for the other shoe to drop, it isn't all that clear, I think, what it will be. And even as we get it, even as Addie meets with Luke at the merchant and offers the alteration of her own deal, we're getting the close-up magic. Quote, "You were right," she says. "I am not one of them. Not anymore, and I am tired of losing, tired of mourning everything I ever tried to love." She reaches out to touch Luke's cheek. "But I won't lose you, and you won't lose me. So yes." She looks straight into his eyes. "Do this, and I'll be yours as long as you want me by your side." End quote. And that's the flourish. That's the prestige. That's what'll get you. We'll get around to that in just a moment. But first, we reset back to Henry with Addie in his arms as he falls into darkness, telling him to live a good life. Telling him, because she is Addie, to find people who can see him the way he is. And last of all, of course, telling him to remember her, to promise. In the hardback edition of this book, part 7 is 11 pages long, and each one, I think, incredibly powerful and important. We begin with the last of the curated pieces, the Polaroids of Addie taken back in Henry's apartment, the fleeting glimpses of the girl who got away impossibly blurred in the simple objective lens of the Polaroid camera. Most importantly here, we get the confirmation we may have expected that these pieces of art are a part of B's thesis, an exploration of Addie's presence and influence through centuries of art. And honestly, I'm feeling a little mean-spirited even bringing this up right now, but I did promise back in the very first episode in this series that I would mention it. Why are the wooden birds on the marble plinth included in the collection? We're about to understand that Henry has written the book of Addie's life, and presumably that book includes the story of the wooden bird, first broken and then lost. But how could B have been sure about the connection between Addie's bird, assuming that it ever really existed, and Revenir by Arlo Murray? Sam's painting features Addie's freckles. They are recognizable, as does the Riddell sketch at the beginning of part 3 and the Renati painting at the beginning of part 5. Toby's song and Henry's Polaroids obviously connect with the overall idea of the collection, but if I were B's academic advisor, I would probably have to suggest cutting the Murray sculpture and Miriam's leaking heart on the grounds of relevance. In any case, Henry wakes the next morning in bed, remembering Addie and reading the journals, and then we cut forward 6 months to B's reaction to this version of Addie's story written by Henry, and it is very charmingly self-aware. I think the book within the book, raising the same questions as the text that we are holding. And it's a minor point perhaps, but I really enjoy the distinction that's made between the two volumes, that the book that we are holding is not the book that Henry writes, not least of all because I'm super glad that Henry didn't superimpose his own story onto Addie's narrative as it was written, which would have been, forgive the blunt language, but a real dick move. The description that we get of the book, no name on the cover, a different dedication, the fact that the title is given in cursive script, I have to tell you, this is the kind of metafictional intersection that basically always works for me. I always love when the book is the book within the book. That's always so strong, but I'm really glad in this instance that we didn't collapse these two stories into one. Not least of all because Henry's version of events doesn't include the most important beat in the entire novel, the latest of the late reveals, the moment that illustrates what this book has been all along. Henry's book distinguishes, in that way, what has come before from what comes after. The part of Addie's life that is written down by Henry is clearly only the first part in a series that will probably never be written, but after this first part, Addie will be different, as we're about to see. In the last chapter, Addie finds the book in a bookstore, hears her own name said aloud, the ultimate fruit of the most important seed, the fullest realization of her identity that is possible in fiction, limited as it is. And then Luke is there, reveling in his victory over her, still 6 months later, but still even now not seeing her, and that will be his downfall. Quote, "Perhaps it will take 20 years. Perhaps it will take 100. But he is not capable of love, and she will prove it. She will ruin him, ruin his idea of them. She will break his heart, and he will come to hate her once again. She will drive him mad, drive him away, and then he will cast her off, and she will finally be free." End quote. Because this book wasn't a love triangle. It wasn't even really a romance for all that it was romantic. It was the story of a woman taking her life, of extricating it from the clutches of her family and her community, and even from the darkness itself, the ultimate patriarchal force in the world. By sheer dint of will and effort, Addie will someday belong only to herself. This, I think, is the book's greatest move. This is what makes this book special, makes this book borderline revolutionary, and what makes so many of the elements from earlier in the text either work or fall away. It presents itself cloaked in conventionality, just as Addie now is cloaking herself in Luke's superficial understanding of romance and of Addie herself. But both Addie and the book have teeth. The details fall away. The tone is elevated to the mythic. Quote, "So Addie says nothing of the new game, the new rules, the new battle that's begun. She only smiles and sets the book back on its shelf and follows him out into the dark." End quote. Because it's not about the book. Not the book that Henry wrote, nor the book that you are holding. It's not about the telling of her story. It's not even about being remembered. It is about what it has always been about. Freedom. agency, self-determination. It is about Addie living the life that she wants, not bound by others, not bound by her curse, not bound by the smallness of Henry or the infinite darkness of Luke, but by nothing more than her own desire. Because this is a fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale we've never seen. This is the story of the Little Red Riding Hood who learns from the big bad wolf, who becomes the big bad wolf, and who will make the metaphorical forest her own. And that'll do it for The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I hope that you have enjoyed this book as much as I have. And if you have questions, comments, thoughts, arguments, and I know you do, then please get in touch and let me know, because I'm not done talking about this book just yet. Whether you're listening to this episode on the day of its release, right before Addie's birthday, or years in the future, you can email starsandswordspod@gmail.com, or you can head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword, share a little love, join the Discord. If you're a Patreon supporter too, you'll be able to join me live on Thursday, March the 14th at noon Eastern Time. That's 11 a.m. Central, 9 a.m. Pacific, for some further discussion about this book and other pieces of genre fiction too. That episode will be available in the Patreon feed after the fact, so if you can make it live, so much the better. And if not, then listen in whenever you can. Next week, we're going to take a hard turn into some Celtic fantasy, and I just realized that we're going to be starting that book on St. Patrick's Day, which is a strong sign. Katherine Kerr's Daggerspell was published originally in 1986, but we will be reading the edited Author's Preferred edition from 1993, which is basically the only edition that you're able to buy nowadays. Anyway, that's the Spectra edition, not the 1986 Del Rey edition. The structure of this book is going to pose us some problems because it has a very long 5th chapter, which I don't really want to split up, but I'm probably going to have to. But I think we're going to try and do the whole book in 3 weeks with a particular focus on its unique world building and Kerr's voice as a fantasy author. So session 1, next week's session, will be the prologue, chapter 1, Kurgany 1052, and chapter 2, Devery 643. Week 2, we'll cover everything up to the first half of chapter 5. We'll see how that works out, and then we'll wrap it up in week 3. It's going to be a brisk pace, and I'm happy to slow down if you guys think that it would help. So if you want me to slow down, send in questions and thoughts, because you know that I won't be able to resist taking those tangents. Next week, I will also announce the poll for the series after Daggerspell, so if you have thoughts and suggestions, get in touch. That is going to do it for this, the 14th episode of Stars and Swords, our final discussion of Addie LaRue, though perhaps not our final discussion of V.E. Schwab. And as always, life seems very long sometimes, but he knows that it will go fast, and he doesn't want to miss a moment. Thanks for listening.